Russian language is an astonishing creature that just cannot be compared with English in an apples with apples kind of way. But is it hard to learn? Well, think of it like learning to ride a massive, great horse. You've got to try and understand the creature first before thinking, no, sorry, this thing's going to just totally kill me. There are many things that Russian high school kids battle with, and often the only clue is in the context. It's especially true with reading, as you'll realise in just a minute. One grammar problem is adjectives and participles with the letter N in the suffix, because there can be either one or two of them, and you've got to get it right. For example, have a look at the word windy in Russian. You see how it's written with one N? But if you want to write the opposite of windy, which is windless, you first add this at the beginning, meaning without. That makes sense so far, right? But then you also have to add another N to the end to make it windy. So it becomes this. Why? Well, the choice of one N or two N's gets more complicated in longer phrases and can change the meaning of what was said. But that's nothing. Many native speakers say that Russian pronunciation marks are the worst because there are so many rules and crazy long sentences. In fact, Tolstoy's texts are often used to test natives' spelling and pronunciation. Why Tolstoy? Well, he's the king of complex sentence constructions. In War and Peace, there is a 229-word sentence that takes up an entire page. Add to that the way that accents can fall on any syllable in a word, causing the meaning of the whole phrase to change. And learners, if you put the stress on the wrong syllable, well, it sounds just plain ridiculous to Russians. For example, can you say this particular world leader's name? Well, I hope you said Vladimir rather than Vladimir, because that is the correct way. But as you're going to hear, Russian used to be even harder. The modern, highly refined Russian that I know you're just dying to learn didn't even appear until a certain polyglot came along and changed things. No, wasn't me. In the early 19th century, Russian wasn't considered a beautiful language. Many people saw it as an ugly language that only the lower classes should speak. In fact, it was so unappealing that upper-class Russians used to speak French instead. Noble kids were even punished for speaking Russians, like the Golitsyn children. Their French governess would punish them by tying a red cloth in the shape of a devil's tongue around their necks. Even Russian novels and poems were often written in French, which was considered far more elegant. Now, this lack of interest by the upper classes meant that the Russian language was essentially left behind. But Russian back then was entirely different from what we hear and speak today. So who was this legendary polyglot who disrupted things? Well, you've probably heard of him, Alexander Pushkin. He was a great poet who wasn't afraid of dangerous things like horses, pistol duels, and ugly languages. I mean, we're talking about someone who knew 16 languages here, mostly self-taught. He was fascinated with the way that one language could help you express something that another language couldn't. And my goodness, you're going to see just how true that is once you get into Russian. It is quite astonishing. I'll leave you a little clue later. Anyway, Pushkin also used to write in French, but he was a really passionate guy and he needed Russian to work for him. So in true visionary style, he led a linguistic revolution. He ditched the stuffy highbrow words and wrote in the way Russian was colloquially spoken, which must have been a real relief for people. Finally, the guy on the street can read a book. So breaking down that language barrier gave Pushkin huge influence. He also literally added words to the language, like words from other languages, and today he's known as the father of modern Russian. But he wasn't the only Russian writer who knew how vastly different two languages can be, like the one who wrote that scandalous book in English, not in Russian. You know who that is? Well, you're going to love this. I'll tell you about him in just a second. But isn't it fascinating how reading can be the catalyst for the transformation of a language? Finally, normal people all of a sudden start reading and everything changes. Reading is powerful, and that's why reading, especially reading stories, can be such a great way to learn the language in the first place, Russian or any other language. This is why I teach languages through story, but if you're learning Russian, for example, you can't just pick up a novel and start reading. No, that would not work. You need something simpler designed for learners, and so I'm going to give you something to try it out. I've written a short story in Russian that is designed to help you learn. The link's in the description down below. This story is completely free, and you'll also get some helpful tips on how to learn Russian through stories too, which is really useful if you're looking for a more natural way to learn Russian. Again, link in the description if you'd like to download it, and let me know if you find it useful. Russian uses the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, an alphabet isn't a language any more than a pencil is a poem. But if you want to be able to read and write Russian, not just mimic people speaking it, it is essential to make friends with the Cyrillic alphabet. And it's actually pretty easy to learn. There are 33 letters, made up of 10 vowels and 21 consonants, and 2 pronunciation signs. At first glance, it may look really confusing, but you already know some of the letters: A, K, M, O, T, and C. The C, of course, is always pronounced like an S, like in the English C in the word cinnamon. Russian words using only these letters will be easy for you. So let's try it out. Mama, got, sto. Actually, letter E is also kind of a friend to you. It's pronounced yeah. Give it a go. You feel quite Russian saying this sound, I believe. And what about this? Test. See? Similar to the English word. You already know plenty of Russian words, you see. Yes, you do, and I will prove it. But first, the rest of the alphabet. Now, these guys over here are not really what they seem. B is really V, H is N, P is R, Y is U, and X is a sound we don't even make in English, but you've probably heard your cat saying it. A bit like that. And don't forget, you can't use C like in cat because it's an S, you see? So this is why it's important to know the Cyrillic alphabet. You have to really forget about the English sounds that you've been primed with. Let's try saying some words beginning with those letters so that you can really hear how it is. Now, who's going to help me?
Сова, рот, хор, новый, вот, утро.
Now remember, this is a video about whether Russian is hard to learn or not. And in language learning, it can be tempting to come across something that's very different or new, like the alphabet in Russian, and conclude that, wow, this language is really hard. But I want you to bear in mind that unfamiliar doesn't necessarily mean difficult. Most foreigners will tell you that learning the Russian alphabet, for example, it's a bit of work up front, but once the unfamiliar becomes familiar, you'll realize that it really isn't that hard per se. So bear that in mind as we talk about this next bit, the unfamiliar letters. They may look scary, but don't worry because they have familiar sounds. I would like you to meet these two letters. No, they are not B's, they are actually signs, hard and soft signs, and they don't make any sound at all. So what is the deal? Okay, most Russian consonants can have two pronunciations, and how you say them changes the meaning of the word. So when you see this sign after a consonant, you know it's pronounced softly. But if it's followed by this sign, well, it gets a hard pronunciation. Have a listen.
Брат, брать.
The sign also tells you whether the word is a verb or a noun. And if it's a noun, the soft sign tells you whether it is feminine or masculine. Kind of tricky in spoken Russian since you can't tell whether there is a sign or not, can you, when you're just listening? So it is a skill worth honing for sure if you plan on learning Russian. Let's not forget vowels. There are 10 vowels and they're divided into pairs. The sounds of each pair are very familiar, but one is a hard indicating vowel, the other is a soft indicating vowel. Sounds a lot like the function of those hard and soft signs, doesn't it? Mystery and intrigue. It's a quick story about how easy it is to completely miss things that native Russians can see. When the politician Boris Nemtsov was murdered, people marched with banners containing what appeared to be his photograph and his name. But to a native Russian speaker, the spelling of Boris with the added soft sign changed the meaning of the name to a statement of intent. Fight on. After this, the British Foreign Secretary actually announced an active step of recruitment for diplomats or spies who knew the difference between the soft and hard signs. I guess it's quite important, right? If you've seen this letter, well, no one will blame you for being tongue-tied when you try to say it. A few fun facts. This letter is used to indicate laughter or a sarcastic smirk. It cannot start a native Russian word. It can never be capitalized, and it's basically impossible to transliterate.
Right here. Bill. Make sure it doesn't sound like bill. Right? Like a bill, like a $10 or a $100 bill. No, it's bill. Bill.
You've really got to practice this one, but don't think you're going to get out of learning it because it's also just a normal letter used in words like pumpkin. I promised there were easier aspects to Russian, so let's go. Russian is a phonetic language, which means you can accurately tell from the spelling of a written word how it should be pronounced. Compare this with learning a language like Chinese, for example, and you quickly realize just how helpful it is to be able to look at a word on paper and be able to actually sound it out. What's more, the most common 100 Russian words are so common that once you know these words, you will understand 50% of the words that you see around you in texts. Russian borrows a lot of words from French, Latin, and Greek. And if that sounds familiar, well, it's because English also borrowed from those very same languages. Great minds think alike, you see, and all that stuff. Check this out. Another easy part of Russian is that it only really has 3 tenses, past, present, and future, which is great news because you only have to learn 3 ways to use a verb. Compare that with English, for example. Think of all the possible ways to talk about the past tense in English. I danced, was dancing, had danced, was going to dance, would have danced. Russian makes it a lot simpler. And there's more. English learners have to learn when to use articles, a or the. A book, the article, an article. But Russian learners don't have to worry about articles at all since it doesn't have any. Another easy aspect is that the grammar rules are nice and consistent. Unlike so many other languages, Russian has predictable verb conjugations. For example, once you see this, you know that it is the past tense. So when we're talking about whether a language is easy or hard, with any language, you're always going to get this mix of easy and hard within the language, but I prefer to think of it as the familiar and the unfamiliar. Once you take unfamiliar things and spend enough time with them that they become familiar, well, they're no longer hard. And this is one of the reasons that the more languages you learn, the easier it is to learn yet another language. There are simply more concepts that you're already familiar with, so it becomes faster to learn. And now, for my favourite part. Remember I said that Russian can help you express things that other languages can't? Well, for starters, there are dozens of incredible words that have 0 equivalent in English. How about the word that means a multi-day drinking binge? That one we might be able to do. Zapoy is serious business, not just a Friday night. You could use it to describe a character who wakes up in a forest with a headache and no idea how he got there or even what the date is. But having access to such distinctive and luminous vocabulary puts a ton of responsibility on the writer. The legendary Russian writer Nabokov first wrote his very famous and scandalous book Lolita in English, but he later realized that one day someone would translate it into Russian, which freaked him out and he just couldn't risk it. He said, the Russian version of Lolita would be entirely degraded and botched, so I decided to translate it myself. So all of this stuff viewed through one lens could be labeled as hard, but viewed through another, it's just so damn interesting that who cares if it's hard or not? You won't care when you're having that much fun. Again, that's one of the main reasons that I teach through story. In my Russian Uncovered course, for example, it's very unlike a regular language textbook. The entire foundation of the course is a story that you read, even as a complete beginner, because we make it simple enough. And the whole premise is that if you enjoy reading the story, you will learn the language naturally. Who wants to try out a Russian tongue twister? Anybody? I know you do.
На дворе трава, на траве дрова, не руби дрова, на траве двора.
Russian vocabulary is actually quite straightforward since most words are compounded, so it's possible to figure them out with a little patience. After you learn the core vocabulary and some of the most common suffixes and prefixes, you can figure out a huge number of words in Russian. Sentences in Russian are also more free-flowing than English. In English, for example, you can rearrange the words, but then the meaning of the sentence changes. In Russian, you can rearrange the words and end up with exactly the same meaning. Now, when you overhear native Russians as a newbie, it can sound like tempers are kind of running high, you know? You know what I mean? Well, what do you think is happening here?
Вот это вот, знаешь, типа... Зеленые тапочки. Я спрашиваю, что? Она говорит, зеленые тапочки.
Well, they are not arguing, guys, as it turns out. They are talking about the women in their lives. Russian is an emotional language, you see, but once you've tamed the beast enough to control it, you realize that, well, you want that emotion too. You need it, in fact. Okay, this is hard. If you are hanging out with Russians and had one too many vodkas, great. Nothing like authentic immersion. But could you talk your way out of a tricky situation? You're going to have to work at this. You have 3 big tricks to master. You've got verbs of motion, conjugations, and noun cases. First, verbs of motion. In Russian, there's no word that just means go. You have to be specific. Are you just going, or are you going and coming back? Not only that, but you also have to imply how you're going to get there, on foot or with some kind of transport. So you get to describe the entire action all at once. So yeah, man, just get to the point, man. Great, so now you have to learn the rest of the 14 pairs of motion verbs. I've written an extensive blog post on verbs of motion, actually, which I'll link to below. You should check that out. Conjugations in Russian are notoriously hard. Russian natives who are watching, correct me if I'm wrong, but the word for love, I believe, has more than 100 possible conjugations. But let's be realistic, you really don't need to know all of those, and conjugation patterns stay the same. So Are you any good at patterns? Noun case is probably the hardest part of Russian for English speakers to master. Some languages, like English, require words to be in a certain sequence for a sentence to make sense. In Russian, the word order doesn't really matter all that much, but the word endings matter. They change depending on many different factors. What's more, Russian has 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter, and it can get pretty darn elaborate and complex. Think you can have an easy conversation about your mum? Well, I hope you know your cases. Word endings also change for singular or plural, but get this, there are different types of plural. That is right, one plural for 2 to 4 things and another plural for 5 or more things. Notice something else here? The numbers 1 and 2 themselves inflect based on gender. Look at that example again and you'll spot it. Now look, the truth is that as far as difficult stuff goes in language learning, this stuff is objectively hard. There are no 2 ways about it, and there are 3 things here that are really quite hard. Verbs of motion, noun cases, and verb conjugation in Russian. These are the things that you will hear learners of Russian complain about all day long. But here's my take. Every language has its difficult stuff. If you open a grammar book and look at a list of all the hard things to learn and think about what it will take to learn those things, you will go insane. So this is where some maturity and experience in your approach to learning hard things really comes into play. Native speakers of a language don't wake up at 0 years old and then systematically learn all the hard things in their language one by one in order from a book. No, they learn naturally, organically, over time as they learn to speak their language, read books, go to school, etc. The way to learn hard things in a language is not to study those things to death. Rather, it's better to take an approach of a rising tide floats all boats. Something that seems hard now will seem a lot easier in 6 months from now once your overall level in the language is stronger. And that's why learning through input and context is so important. You've heard a lot about reading in this video already, and Russian authors, and in all my videos, to be fair, you've heard about reading. But this is where reading as a strategy really comes into its own, because reading uniquely has the power to make hard things easy if you give it enough time. Don't think of Russian as being difficult, really don't. Think of it as having layers of sophistication and genius sorely missing from the English language. It will allow you to express yourself in ways you've never been able to, just like Pushkin and Nabokov. Think about that. It's really quite brilliant when you think about it. If you are any kind of person with a deep burning in your soul that needs expressing, but you've never quite found the English words for that, then Russian, my friend, is the language for you. But definitely don't start until you've watched this video, which covers some very important stuff that we really didn't have time to get to in this video.